The ASUS ROG Mothership has some extremely powerful hardware inside, including 8-core i9-9980HK overclockable CPU and Nvidia RTX 2080 graphics. So let's find out how well it performs in games at 1080p, 1440p, and 4K resolutions. Let's start off with the specs. There's an 8-core, 16-thread overclockable i9-9980HK CPU, RTX 2080 graphics, definitely no max Q here, 64GB of memory and dual channel, and a 17.3-inch 4K 60Hz screen with G-Sync. You can find examples of other configurations and updated prices linked in the description. What makes the Mothership different is that the heat generating components are behind the screen, so it should be able to get plenty of air no problem. This design does mean that it needs a stand to sit up, and can't really be used as a traditional laptop. It's more of an all-in-one desktop replacement. The Armoury Crate software allows us to disable Nvidia Optimus for G-Sync, which will boost performance in some games, so I've used this. I've also performed all tests in turbo mode for best performance, and this overclocks the processor and graphics to these levels. We're only covering gaming performance here, so if you're new to the channel, you'll definitely want to get subscribed for the thermal testing and full review videos where I'll push the overclocks even further. We'll start off by going through all games at all setting levels at 3 resolutions, then afterwards we'll see how the ASUS Mothership compares with some other gaming laptops. Battlefield 5 was tested in campaign mode. At 1080p, even RTX was playing alright, with 60fps averages still reached at ultra settings, while RTX off, shown by the purple bars, was getting much higher performance. 130fps at ultra is pretty crazy stuff. Stepping up to 1440p and we're still getting results better than what most other gaming laptops are able to provide at 1080p, though the RTX results are now about in line with the 1080p results from those other machines. RTX on was still playable at all settings, though much better at medium, and 100fps at ultra with RTX off at this resolution is quite impressive. At 4K, RTX on is pretty much a write-off at all but the lower setting levels, making it kind of pointless in my opinion. However, we were still almost able to average 60fps even at ultra 4K with RTX off. Control was tested by running through the start of the game. And again, I've tested both RTX on in green and RTX off in purple. RTX on played fine even at max settings, though like Battlefield 5, we could get much higher FPS with RTX off. At 1440p, RTX off still played perfectly fine for me, averaging above 60fps at max settings, though RTX on was starting to get a little slower at medium and high settings, but was usable. At 4K, RTX is pretty much a no-go. However, with ray tracing off, it was still playable at low settings and didn't look too bad. The game looks quite decent even with the low preset. Shadow of the Tomb Raider was tested with the built-in benchmark, and these are some of the best results I've ever seen from a laptop. Well, I guess it's not really a laptop if you can't use it on your lap, plus it'd crush you. Anyway, for reference at max settings, the Mothership is even beating the Alienware 51M with 9900K. We'll look at how those compare soon. At 1440p, the frame rates are still good even at higher settings, still excellent performance here. At 4K, the results drop back significantly, however 60fps was still achieved with the highest setting preset, with almost 100fps still from lowest settings. Ghost Recon Breakpoint was also tested with the built-in benchmark. Starting out with 1080p, ultra settings was still averaging above 100fps. Again, extremely impressive results compared to the other laptops I've tested in this game so far. At 1440p, the frame rates dropped back a little, but 100fps averages was still possible at very high settings, and above 60 was still coming out of ultimate settings. 4K is pretty rough on this resource-heavy game, but the Mothership is handling it pretty well, with 60fps still possible at very high settings. Borderlands 3 was again tested using the built-in benchmark, so the exact same test was done at all setting levels and all resolutions, and above 100fps was still possible with high settings in this test. At 1440p, there's minimal change at the lower setting levels and more of a difference at the higher presets, which are more resource intensive. Though even at max settings, above 60fps averages was still being reached. At 4K, the frame rate at max settings almost drops in half, and medium settings are now required to maintain above 60fps averages in this test. Fortnite was tested with the replay feature, And while this game runs fine on pretty much any modern machine, I was interested to see how high it would go on the Mothership, and it was almost possible to get to 500 FPS at low settings 1080p, with 200 being hit maxed out. Even at 1440p, the frame rates are still quite high. Maxed out with epic settings was around 100 even for the 1% low, well above the refresh rate of my display. When running at the native 4K resolution of the display my unit has, 60 FPS was still being reached at epic settings, so definitely still usable, and much higher frame rates were still possible at lower settings. The Division 2 was tested with the built-in benchmark, and as a game that seems to be on the resource-heavy side, these results are much better compared to most machines I usually test at 1080p. At 1440p, high settings was still able to average above 100 FPS, and above 200 was possible at low settings. Pretty impressive stuff. At 4K, high settings are still averaging around 60 FPS. And the 1% low performance isn't too far below the averages either, so the performance was quite consistent. PUBG was tested using the replay feature, just like Fortnite. I know we're dealing with some powerful hardware here, but this game has really come a long way compared to last year. There have definitely been some optimizations to help it out. Anyway, 200 FPS could be achieved with medium settings at 1080p. At 1440p, even ultra settings is still able to average 120 FPS, with above 200 FPS still possible at minimum settings. 4K was still able to offer 60 FPS averages at ultra settings. Granted, I doubt many people would play competitively at this resolution and frame rate, but it still worked fine with minimal dips in performance, as shown by the 1% low, which wasn't too far behind the average. Assassin's Creed Odyssey was tested with the built-in benchmark, and as a CPU-heavy test, seems to benefit well from the overclocked 8-core CPU. This game doesn't need a super high frame rate to play, so at 1080p, this should be just fine even with the ultra-high preset. At 1440p, the results don't change much. Ultra-high settings is still averaging above 60 FPS in this test, which is still better than most other machines I've tested at 1080p. The 4K results actually look closer to what I typically see at 1080p with most other machines, so it should still go alright with around high settings, while medium was needed to average 60 FPS in this test. The Witcher 3 is another game that doesn't really benefit from super high FPS, but at 1080p we're still able to hit 140 FPS even with the Ultra preset, which is outstanding performance. At 1440p, Ultra settings was still sitting around the 100 FPS mark, and I still think this is plenty for this game for most people. At 4K, I thought it was still okay at Ultra settings, but I did find high and medium settings to feel a bit better. Rainbow Six Siege was tested with the game's built-in benchmark, and even with the 100% render scale, well above 200 FPS was being hit in this test with the highest Ultra setting preset. At 1440p, Ultra settings was still giving great performance, around the 150 FPS mark, though more than double this was still coming out of the low preset. At 4K, the results dropped back a fair bit comparatively, with high settings around the 100 FPS mark, which I think is still a good result for this test. Metro Exodus was tested using the game's built-in benchmark. However, this one is more of a worst case and doesn't represent performance throughout the entire game. Despite this, Ultra settings was still giving above 60 FPS averages at 1080p. At 1440p, Ultra settings is now on 60 FPS. And like most other games, these results are better than most other laptops I test with 1080p, just for rough comparison. The 4K results look like what I generally see from many mid-range laptops at 1080p, so it just goes to show how much power the Mothership is packing. Far Cry 5 was also tested with the built-in benchmark, and as a CPU-heavy test, we're seeing nice results here with that overclocked 8-core i9 CPU. At 1440p, the results are still excellent and easily above 100 FPS. Then at 4K, like many other games, the numbers do drop back quite a bit. However, despite this drop, Ultra settings was still around 60 FPS. Let's also take a look at how this config of the ASUS Mothership compares with other laptops. Use these results as a rough guide only, as they were tested at different times with different drivers. I've tested Battlefield 5 with Ultra settings, and I've got the Mothership highlighted in red. This is the best result I've ever recorded from a machine like this. It was actually ahead of the Alienware 51M with desktop 9900K, most likely as I found the 2080 would run at 200 watts, so it had more GPU power. Here are the results from Far Cry 5 with Ultra settings in the built-in benchmark. This time the 51M was slightly ahead in terms of average FPS, but it was only a couple of frames. while the 1% low from the Mothership was ahead. Either way, both machines are clearly on a completely different level from what I usually test. These are the results from Shadow of the Tomb Raider with the built-in benchmark at highest settings, and again the Mothership was out ahead here. This was expected given the GPU power limit differences between the two, and that this test at max settings is fairly GPU heavy. As we've seen, the ASUS Mothership is offering serious levels of performance, which is to be expected. It's a thick machine with an overclocked 8-core CPU and overclocked RTX 2080 graphics, capable of running up to 200 watts. 1080p and 1440p gaming was no problem at all, while many titles at 4K ran alright too depending on setting level. There are definitely some compromises to be made with a machine like this, mainly in terms of size, battery life, portability, and price. It's more of a desktop replacement that can still be moved rather than a gaming laptop, especially due to the unique design of the Mothership. The way it opens kind of prevents you actually using this thing on your lap. But we'll look at that more in the upcoming detailed review. I'll be testing thermal performance in the next detailed video, so if you're new to the channel, consider getting subscribed for that, as well as for future tech videos like this one.